Throughout history, there have been many wars fought by different empires across the world. So the Mongol Empire, the Chinese Empire, the Roman Empire, the Spartans, the Vikings, you name it. There's been some type of battle taking place for some reason or for some piece of land that they wanted to conquer at the time. And these wars and battles might have taken months, maybe even years to even finish, also causing both sides casualties. But this particular war in modern history didn't have a battlefield. It was a prolonged argument between two superpowers at the time. The United States and the Soviet Union were more of at a standstill, just standing on different ends of the world arguing with one another. Today I'll inform you about the Cold War, and I'll talk about from the beginning of the end of World War II to the early 90s. According to the JFK Library website, the Cold War started as soon as World War II ended, and this is where soldiers didn't really fight each other directly. This is more of they were ready for a fight. There wasn't really a fight between the U.S. and the Russians at the time. First, we'll talk about the time during the Cold War. Second, the events that led the events that happened because of the Cold War, and then finally, a very particular time for U.S. history is when they were able to complete their mission of landing on the moon against the Soviet Union. So let's take a look at the beginning of all. Both the United States and the Soviet Union and the rest of the Allies worked together to fight against the Nazi Germany. During the 1945, at the end, the alliance began to crumble, and this led a lot of tension between the East and West. During the Potsdam Conference, is where the Allies discussed an agreement to have joint occupation of Germany. So the Soviet Union would get one side, and the rest of the Allies would get the west side. The Soviet Union thought it would be a better idea to have a buffer separating both sides of their territory so none can interfere with their plans. This separated themselves from the Allies and also made East and West Germany. According to the article, the JFK Library, in 1948, the Soviet Union decided to cut off all road and railroad traffic, cutting off supplies from the west side, saying that we don't need your help or more capable of doing it ourselves, feeding our own people, supplying our own armies. And the way the U.S. and Great Britain replied to that was okay. They responded with an airlift that supplied the Berlin or east side of Berlin um, about 231 days worth of supplies. So now all this has been established, and now there's a divider between in Berlin. The U.S. became very concerned about the communist ideas spreading to the West, and this led to the Red Scare. At this part of the Cold War, the U.S. became very, very concerned about the Soviet Union spreading their communist ideas to the West, and this was from the 40s to the 60s. Events like the Bay of Pigs, the Vietnam War, the missile Cuban crisis, even as well, were the outcomes of the U.S. trying to combat the communist ideals spreading towards the western side of the world. And this is where the whole famous espionage, propaganda, arms races, and economical aid and proxy wars took place. And with all this happening, this led to an arms race. This led to an arms buildup, if anything, where both sides, the U.S. and the Soviet Union, were trying to get as many nuclear weapons as they possibly can. But um, it's stated in the National World War II Museum that the Soviet Union weren't really successful in building their own ballistic missiles. They had an idea where they would set their own spies, send them to the U.S. and steal documentations and plans and send them in, implant them in science labs and military bases where they can steal all this information and start building their own weapons of mass destruction. And then, as soon as both sides were able to accumulate a large amount of these missiles, there was the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Soviet Union decided to have a plan where they would stash missiles in Cuba, so that if they ever wanted to have an attack against the U.S., they would first attack the Eastern Seaboard. So hitting cities like New York, Boston, Washington D.C., the Capitol building, and the rest of the Eastern Seaboard, just blowing them up with missiles. The president at the time, JFK, got word of this shipment of missiles going back and forth from the Soviet Union to Cuba. So he had an idea where he's going to have a naval blockade, which was pretty successful, but at the time it was a little risky because it was more of like who's going to blink first, who's going to make the first move, who's going to launch the first missile and start this nuclear war that the world's been prepping for. right? But then Kennedy decided to have a plan where he would contact Prime Minister Khrushchev, and they were able to exchange words and talk like diplomatic men, and they were able to come to an agreement where the U.S. agreed to remove missiles from Turkey, and the Soviet Union were able to to take out their missiles from Cuba. So now that there's a peace, and this is where the ideal of the Cold War kind of ending right here in this point of history in the 60s, and this is where the world changed. According to the article, The Library, it stated that in 1989 the Berlin Wall came down, and this allowed the Eastern European countries to adopt democratic ideas and start having their own elections and bringing peace to their side of the world. But unfortunately, some countries didn't see that and didn't experience that. A lot of them fell into chaos and violence. And then around the early 90s, or 1991, is when the Soviet Union fell. But all these events, all these things that happened at this time led to a very significant part in American history, and that was the space race. Due to both the U.S. and the Soviet Union bumping heads and trying to beat each other up and saying, "I have the best technology, I have the best technology, or we have the best rockets," or "No, we have the best rockets," it gave them the technology to. It gave birth to the idea of a space race, knowing that they can explore and probably, hopefully, with hopes of landing somebody on the moon one day. According to the National Air and Space Museum, the space race was born because of the Cold War. And both governments were building missiles for self-defense, and now they, hey, we can start building missiles, start launching people into space. But unfortunately, they didn't have rockets powerful enough to do that. They only had enough power to either launch a satellite into orbit or a living being. So when you heard stories of like a dog or a monkey getting launched into space, that was the living beings, or eventually leading to the first human being to be in space, not in the on the moon exactly, but to be in space outside of our atmosphere. But due to Operation Paperclip was when, after World War II ended, the United States gathered as many German and Austrian scientists to help develop and engineer the planning of American technology and rockets. They were able to develop and they were able to develop a rocket sending people to the moon and eventually landing in the whole one step for man, one step for country, one step for land. Man, I'm probably butchering that up, but we know what the saying is that the U.S. was successful on delivering and landing somebody on the moon, and that was more of like a very significant part of history for the American public. So now today we discussed the beginning of the Cold War, the Red Scare, and the space race, and other events were outcomes of the Cold War. Even though the Cold War wasn't really fought on a battlefield, it was fought over years after World War II to the 90s. Just two countries, two superpowers, just butting heads like, I'm better, no, I'm better. It's kind of like who has a bigger stick at the time. But this is what gave birth to a lot of significant events that a lot of people remember, or a lot of people were a part of. Unfortunately, that a lot of casualties happened in the Vietnam War and the Bay of Pigs, and the Cuban Missile Crisis, where like the world almost got blown up to smithereens. But luckily, the power of humanity, people that really cared about making a difference, we were able to avoid a nuclear war, and it was we're able to spread peace into the eastern there was a time where peace was in the eastern side after the Berlin Wall came down, and hopefully we never have to experience another event like that ever in our lifetime. But I do believe that if that does happen, there are going to be people standing up for what's right.